Hello, my name is Shiling, and I'm a senior at the University of Pennsylvania, studying health and societies with a minor in computer science. When thinking about the question, what has been your most intriguing research discovery at Penn, my mind automatically jumps to the independent study that I completed in my fall 2018 semester for my capstone research requirement for my health and societies major. My topic discussed how the United States embargo against Cuba impacted the health of the Cuban population and the development of the biotech industry in Cuba. Although this was a research study that took place over the course of one semester, it was a research question that I had been developing for about a year and a half. This started in fall 2017 when I did a project on the maternal mortality rates, a project on the paternal mortality rates in Cuba between the years of 1990 and 2000, and the positive correlation that it had with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and the enactment of the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, a sanction that is part of the United States embargo. My takeaway from this research was not just the positive correlation in this particular health topic, but the negative consequences that it had on individual lives. This led me to pursue this research question, but from a different angle in the next semester. That means that the following semester, when I studied abroad, I did an independent study, but this time I looked at the role of the international community and institutional practices that facilitated the existence of this embargo for the past 58 years, something that it's still continuing today. In that independent study, I looked specifically at the role of public international law and particularly the role of intergovernmental bodies such as the United Nations. When considering the results of this case, I realized that I no longer wanted to focus on the political relationships between governmental bodies, but I wanted to take an interdisciplinary approach and look at the political, economic, and social factors that influence the interaction between the embargo and the health of the Cuban population. With this in mind, the research question for the independent study that I will cover in this presentation, this research question asked, how does the United States embargo against Cuba impact the development of the biotech industry and consequently the ability of the government to respond to the health needs of its population. This timeline goes from 1959 with the Cuban Revolution to 2018 with the present state of the biotech industry. The topics that I will discuss are the topics that I discussed in my paper. We'll start off with a brief history of the two sanctions, the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992 and the Helms-Burton Act of 1996. Then we'll do a brief history of the Cuban national public health system, and then a brief history of the Cuban biotech industry. And I do this history so that you have background information to really get the understanding of how these different areas interacted and how they affected one another. Then we'll end with a conclusion of my results and just a takeaway of my experience throughout this process. To begin, we have a history of the embargo. We start with the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992. This particular sanction limited the importation and exportation of products between the U.S. and Cuba, limiting the importation and exportation of medical supplies, but altogether banning any exchange of products that can be used for the biotech industry. Then we have, and they did this by banning trade between Cuba and any U.S.-owned subsidiary. And we move on to the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, which further restricted trade by doing punitive measures against third-party countries that traded with Cuba based on investments on Cuban property that was formerly owned by U.S. citizens. For a brief history of the public health system, we start with the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which was the rise to power of Fidel Castro and, of course, his regime, which emphasized the expansion of the public health system and the reduction of health disparities between rural and urban populations. They did this by expanding the reach of state institutions through the nationalization of private institutions, also by creating rural health programs such as the 1960 Rural Health Services Program and 1974 polyclinics, which extended the availability and access to medical professionals and medical help for the rural populations. And then, of course, the reorganization of medical education, medical research through the Literacy Campaign of 1960, which also enacted the free public education and the reconstruction of education institutions such as research laboratories and higher education universities and primary schools. Now we move on to a brief history of the biotech industry. The biotech industry became the focal point of the public health system and the future of the public health system of Cuba in 1981 with the outbreak of the dengue fever. This was also, because of its socialist regime, a state-funded industry where investments by the state were central to the research and development cycle. They did this through the allocation of resources and organization integration in order to facilitate a collective mindset that said that we all work together, we all contribute together. There is no individual competition because we are one source. This allocation of resources came from institutions or organizations such as the West Havana Scientific Pool, which you can say is the Silicon Valley of the biotech industry of Cuba. In here you'll find, or in this area you'll find, in-house or a collection of in-house institutions extending from research and development labs to manufacturing plants to government agents to universities and hospitals. And of course, it is a closed cycle, which means that for the organization purposes of the industry, the state controls every single step from research to distribution of that product. And also we have something called open source patent pools that's available because the state owns patents. And they did this with the hopes of decreasing transaction and licensing costs and thus increasing collaboration and innovation. Now that we have a quick background, we can now look into the relationship between the embargo and the industry. The embargo limited the development of the biotech industry in three ways: by restricting licensing, restricting information sharing, and restricting financial support. It restricted licensing by using the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the Bureau of Industry Security to limit what types of supplies can actually enter the country, meaning any supply that was deemed to abuse human rights or to be for the production of the biotech industry was absolutely prohibited. So right off the bat, we know that any supply that's going to be used for the biotech industry will not, under any circumstances, enter the country. There are medical supplies that don't fall under this, but of course there's another restriction because of the ambiguity of the abuse of human rights. If it is a biotech product, there's a chemical compound, and there's always the possibility of dual usage. Furthermore, we move on to its limitations on information sharing, meaning that there are scholarly works or scientific conferences or expositions that Cuban citizens do not have access to if they take place in the United States, and therefore they don't have access to this knowledge. Then we move on to the restriction in financial support. The U.S. denied credit to Cuba from any international lending institution by using its veto power. Moreover, it denied aid to any country that traded with Cuba based on a credit system or long-term payment system, which means that Cuba now has to pay for any resource using hard currency, which limits the quality of the resource they can access and the quantity. A little stat for you to put into perspective the big change that occurred. Cuba before 1992, remember Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, before this date, they imported $719 million worth of products, 90% of which was food and medicine. And after 1992, over the course of 3 years, this dropped from 719 to 0.3 million. We can only imagine the negative consequences this would have had on individual lives and the population and its social development as a whole. In conclusion, we can see that there are negative consequences, but in my research, I also found that there were joint ventures in what's called South-to-South technology transfer. So that's something that I'd like to pursue in a future research project. Moreover, this has been an incredibly satisfying experience because it introduced me to a new area of study that I'd like to pursue, and that's attending law school for information technology law, particularly with a focus in intellectual property rights law. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.